Good evening. I'm Sherry Levine, President of Viking Savings Bank in Alexandria, and my question is, how will you resolve the difference between the House and Senate transportation bills to get a deal passed this session?
Oh, this is an easy one. I'm going to throw this one at Senator Han. How are you going to resolve the differences, whatever those differences might be, whether it's should there be a gas tax, should there not be?
Well, I think the biggest difference is I think there's broad agreement that we would like to do some things to help fund the infrastructure in the state of Minnesota, across the state. The metro area, obviously we need some help here, but also in rural Minnesota. The real, I think, sticking point is whether or not we're going to have another $1 billion or $2 billion tax increase to fund this, or can we use existing tax revenues and dedicate those to road and bridge projects? I think that really is the problem and the debate. And I don't want to steal from the speaker, but he has talked publicly about let's work on things that we agree with. And I think all of us agree that we need to do something for roads and bridges. The financing of this may be the sticking point. But you know what? We've got these tax revenues coming in. We've got a surplus. Let's use this opportunity to restructure what we do and dedicate some of these existing sales tax revenues for automotive issues and say, let's put those into the fund that builds roads and bridges across the state. We can agree to that. Let's just do that. Maybe we can't solve the whole problem, but we could do that. And I think that maybe, in my opinion, is the path to a compromise.
Senator Bach, again, you know a lot about the tax structure in the state. Governor Dayton has said repeatedly that would leave too big a hole in the budget to fund other priorities. But what about the idea that Republicans often talk about that transportation should be a core function of government like education and public safety and those types of things?
Well, the challenge and the reason that transportation funding is constitutionally dedicated, that's where the sales tax on your motor vehicles goes, that's where the gas tax money you pay goes, that's where your license tabs go. It's constitutionally dedicated, so really it can only be spent on transportation. And the reason that legislators long before me and voters long before me, and there's been 15 or more amendments on the ballot for voters to vote on in Minnesota about transportation, is transportation infrastructure improvements can always be delayed. And that's why it needs a dedicated funding source. And if you put it into competition with everything else in the general fund, it is never going to compete with health care and education and other public safety, other spending priorities at the legislature. We're going to have a new legislature this time next year. They're going to reflect the priorities of the voters in the 2016 election. But I will guarantee you, if you try to dedicate general fund money to transportation this year, and we do that, a future legislature is going to undo it. It's not going to be a priority, so it's not a sustainable long-term plan. It has to be dedicated, constitutionally dedicated money. That's why those funding streams all go there, so that when we sell bonds for roads and bridges, we know the revenue is going to be there to pay the debt service on the bonds. So the Senate is going to continue to advocate for some kind of a mix of dedicated funding, whether it revolves around a hybrid of license tabs and motor vehicle excise taxes or gas taxes, but money that is constitutionally dedicated. The interesting thing about transportation is I think there's a pretty broad agreement that we need about $600 million a year for the next 10 years to rebuild our transportation infrastructure. Just spending a couple $100 million or $300 million this year, and all of us go on the campaign trail and put out great literature about what a great job that we did, does not solve the long-term transportation infrastructures this state faces. And I can tell you what, it takes courage to vote for a tax increase. Anybody can vote against one. But to stand up and say transportation infrastructure is important, as a legislator, I'm going to vote to create the money to make sure we make the investments, that's not an easy vote. That takes very courageous lawmakers, and we don't have enough of them at the Capitol.
Senator Bach, just sticking with that point for a minute, a few years ago, Democrats controlled the governor's office and the House and Senate, and it didn't pass then. It's not easy to pass it, though, is it? I mean,
it passed the Senate.
But well, I guess I'm going to have to direct my next question then to Representative Thiessen, who was Speaker of the House at the time. It's not easy, is it, to pass a gas tax increase, whether it's an election year or not an election year? Frankly, I think every year is an election year, but your thoughts on this?
Well, no, I think that that is true. I think Senator Bach is probably correct in that, however. But to me, this is not even at this point an issue of whether transportation dollars are going to compete with education or health care, even though I think that is true. You know, I was open to talking about this dedication of the $300+ million from the sales tax on auto parts to pay for transportation when we had a different kind of surplus. But again, it comes down to math at this point. If we only have $450 million in ongoing money to spend, and you want to do $2 billion in tax cuts, and you want to spend $300 million plus a year out of the general fund for roads and bridges, how does that math possibly add up? It doesn't. So let's just start with those facts before we start talking about all these dreams we're going to have about doing this. Those are the facts that we're facing right now. And so if we want to solve this problem, and we need to solve it, I believe, and you know, frankly, in 2013 and 14, we did a lot of stuff in those 2 years and raised taxes that many of you, I suppose, opposed at the time. But we did a lot of things. It was probably just a bridge too far for us to get. That's kind of the frank answer. But the other thing that's important about this, and now I'm sure I'm boring you, is that...
You should juggle. Try
is that the Speaker has said that transit is a controversial issue in Minnesota. And that, to me, for a statewide leader to say that transit is a controversial issue, that is going to be a huge impediment to getting something done, because we do need to invest in our roads and bridges in the metro area and all across greater Minnesota, but we also need to invest in transit. And I know business leaders here in the metro area are strongly supportive of that. And so if we're going to, thank you. So if we're going to pass a bill, let's make sure it's a bill that actually serves the whole state and serves all of our needs and serves all of our people. Elderly people that can't drive anymore, young millennials that actually want a transit-oriented economy. That's the direction we need to go if we're actually going to solve this problem.
Speaker Daudt, your chamber came up with this idea about diverting the sales tax on auto parts and maybe car leases and rentals. You're going to give it a go again this year, and do you think this is the year that could pass despite clearly some opposition?
We absolutely will, and we think it's a very good solution to the problem. I'll remind people that the reason that new revenue is being suggested or suggested that it's needed is that the gas tax in the future is scheduled to decline as vehicles get more efficient. I'll also remind folks that this is the first time that a gas tax has been proposed as a percentage of the cost of the gas instead of so many cents per gallon. That's by design. With gas prices low, and I think everybody in here would agree that at some point gas prices are going to go back up, that this is going to fool Minnesotans and capture a whole bunch of revenue. I was really happy to see the governor declared the gas tax dead last November at the November forecast. He has since kind of reeled those comments back and said that, well, maybe a gas tax is on the table. And I understand that what he's doing is positioning for negotiating. But taking more money out of Minnesota families' pockets at a time when, frankly, they're struggling, and believe me, I know they're struggling. That's not right. And I come from an area of the state where most of the people commute into the metro area, and their gas budget is a huge part of their budget every month. So what we're going to do is continue to hurt Minnesota families and hurt Minnesota's economy to fund this. I'll also remind people that in negotiations last year, when we had a $2 billion surplus, the reason we didn't get tax relief and the reason we didn't get business tax relief is because even with that $2 billion surplus, Democrats held it hostage for increasing the gas tax. So when we had $2 billion of surplus revenue, we didn't have enough, even then, to fund all of the things that they wanted to spend money on and fund our priority. And the reality is very simple. We have the resources to fund this priority if we focus on what matters to Minnesotans. And if we pass a bill on the things we all agree on, we can get it done this session.
All right. Well, I'm glad we finally solved that pesky transportation funding problem once and for all.